Tonight, as you begin to settle in and allow your body to rest, take a slow, gentle breath in and then exhale, letting the weight of the day begin to fall away. There is nothing you need to solve right now, nowhere you need to go, and nothing required of you in this moment except to rest. As your breathing slows, allow your mind to quiet, and let this story carry you softly into peace. This is a story about a life that unfolded slowly, imperfectly, and beautifully over time. A life filled with quiet beginnings, unexpected turns, moments of courage, deep failure, and lasting redemption. It's the story of David, a shepherd, a warrior, a king, and a man who learnt what it means to trust God through every season. As you listen, you don't need to hold on to every detail. Let the words simply wash over you. Let the rhythm of the story become steady and calming, like a quiet stream flowing through your thoughts. If your mind drifts, that's okay. Just gently return to the sound of the story and allow yourself to relax even deeper. Before we begin, take a moment to gently support this space of peace. If this kind of story helps you unwind, consider liking the video and subscribing so you can return here whenever you need rest. And as you listen tonight, feel free to comment down below, share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's a quiet way of connecting, knowing others around the world are resting alongside you. Now settle in a little more. Let your shoulders drop, let your jaw relax, let your breathing become slow and steady. And as the story continues, simply listen and rest. In the quiet hills surrounding Bethlehem, where the land rolled in gentle waves of dust and grass, there lived a boy who was easy to forget. His name was David, the youngest son of Jesse, and in a household full of stronger, older brothers, he was rarely the one anyone noticed first. The days passed with a familiar rhythm in his life. Sunrise over the hills, the soft bleating of sheep, and the long, silent hours spent beneath an open sky. While others spoke of battle, strength, and honor, David's world was quieter, hidden from the eyes of men but not, as it would one day be revealed, from the eyes of God. His brothers were everything he was not, tall, commanding, and battle-ready. When they walked through the village, people took note. Their voices carried weight, their presence demanded attention. David, by contrast, was often sent away before conversations even began. "Take the sheep," his father would say, not unkindly, but with a tone that suggested the matter required no discussion. And so David would go, staff in hand, guiding the flock out into the fields where no crowds gathered and no applause followed. At first glance, it might have seemed like a lonely existence. The hills did not speak, and the sheep offered little companionship beyond their constant need for guidance. Yet, in that stillness, something deeper was forming within him. The solitude that might have crushed another boy became for David a place of growth. With no audience to impress and no one to measure himself against, he began to discover a different kind of strength, one rooted not in appearance, but in trust. There were dangers in those fields, though few in Bethlehem spoke of them in detail. A shepherd's life was not merely peaceful wandering, it required vigilance. Predators lurked at the edges of the hills, lions, bears, and thieves who saw unattended flocks as easy gain. David learned quickly that hesitation could cost everything. When a sheep wandered too far, he pursued it. When shadows moved too close, he stood his ground. He was not the strongest of Jesse's sons, but out there, strength was not measured by size alone. It was measured by courage, by willingness to act when no one else was there to help. Over time, his hands grew calloused, his reflexes sharpened, and his heart steadied. He learned to read the land, the way the wind shifted before a storm, the way the flock responded to distant movement, the subtle signs that danger was near. These lessons were not taught in halls or battlefields. They were learnt in silence, through repetition, through responsibility that could not be ignored. But perhaps the most defining part of David's life in those hills was not the danger, nor even the discipline. It was the presence he felt in the quiet. With nothing but the sky stretched endlessly above him, David began to speak words that no one else heard. At first they may have been simple thoughts, spoken aloud to pass the time, but slowly those words turned into something more. They became prayers, songs, expressions of a heart reaching beyond the visible world. He would look at the stars as they filled the night sky, countless and unmoving, and wonder how something so vast could exist. He would sit beside still waters, watching the reflection of the heavens ripple with the slightest breeze, and feel a sense of peace that had no clear source. In those moments, David was not the overlooked son, not the forgotten shepherd. He was simply a soul aware that he was not alone. There is a kind of clarity that comes in solitude, a stripping away of distractions that reveals what truly matters. For David, that clarity led him to trust in something greater than himself. He did not yet know where his life would lead, nor could he have imagined the weight of the future that awaited him. But in the fields of Bethlehem, he began to understand a truth that would carry him through every trial to come, that worth is not determined by who sees you, but by who knows you. Back in his father's house, life continued without much change. His brothers trained, prepared, and positioned themselves for futures that seemed far more significant. David returned from the fields each day with dust on his clothes and stories that few asked to hear. It would have been easy for bitterness to take root, for resentment to grow in the shadow of constant dismissal. Yet there is no record of such a shift in his heart. If anything, the opposite seemed to occur. David remained faithful in the small things. He cared for what was entrusted to him, even when it felt insignificant. He showed up each day, not because it brought recognition, but because it was his responsibility. This quiet faithfulness, unnoticed by others, was shaping him in ways that could not yet be seen. There is a tendency in human nature to equate visibility with value, to believe that if something is not seen, it does not matter. But David's early life stands as a quiet contradiction to that idea. In the hidden places, far from the attention of crowds, something essential was being built. His character was forming, his courage was being tested, and his relationship with God was deepening. The world would later know David as a warrior, a king, a man of influence and power. Songs would be written about his victories, and his name would carry weight across generations. But none of that began in a palace or on a battlefield. It began here, in the unnoticed fields, in the long hours of solitude, in the quiet decision to remain faithful when no one was watching. There is something profoundly human about that season of his life. Many people know what it feels like to be overlooked, to stand in the background while others are chosen, to carry responsibilities that seem small compared to the roles of those around them. It is easy in those moments to question purpose, to wonder if anything meaningful is truly happening. Yet David's story suggests otherwise. It reminds us that the unseen seasons are not wasted, that the quiet moments, the ones that feel insignificant, are often the very places where the most important work is being done. Not outwardly, but inwardly, not in ways that draw attention, but in ways that prepare the heart. As the sun would set each evening over Bethlehem, casting long shadows across the hills, David would gather the flock and lead them home. Another day completed, another quiet chapter in a life that, to most, seemed ordinary. But beneath that ordinary surface, something extraordinary was unfolding. He did not know it yet, but those same hands that guided sheep would one day lead a nation. The same voice that sang in solitude would one day write songs that echoed through generations. The same heart that sought God in the fields would one day be described as a heart after God himself. For now, though, he remained where he had always been, on the outside, overlooked, unseen by many, but not unseen by God. And in the story that was beginning to unfold, that was all that mattered. The rhythm of life in Bethlehem had not changed for David. The morning still broke over the same hills, the sheep still wandered under his watch, and the quiet still wrapped itself around him like a familiar garment. If anything stirred beyond the ordinary, it had not yet reached him, but far from the fields, in places where decisions shaped the course of nations, Something had already begun to move. The current king, Saul, had once stood tall in the eyes of the people. He had been chosen for his stature, his presence, his outward strength, everything that seemed to define leadership. Yet over time something had shifted. His heart had drifted from obedience, and the favor that once rested on him had grown distant. What had begun with promise was now unraveling in quiet but undeniable ways. It was in this moment of transition that God spoke again to Samuel, the prophet who had once anointed Saul. The message was not easy. Samuel had poured his hope into the first king of Israel, had watched him rise, had believed in what he could become. To now hear that Saul's time was ending carried a weight that was both personal and national. "How long will you mourn for Saul?" The voice of God seemed to press into him. There was no harshness in it, but there was clarity. The future would not be found in what had already failed. "Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." The command was simple, but the implications were not. To anoint another king while Saul still sat on the throne was a dangerous act. It could be seen as betrayal, rebellion, even treason. Samuel understood the risk. "How can I go?" he questioned. "If Saul hears of it, he will kill me." The response did not remove the danger, but it provided a path forward. Samuel was instructed to go under the appearance of offering a sacrifice, to invite Jesse and his sons to join him. There, in that gathering, the chosen one would be revealed. And so Samuel went. When he arrived in Bethlehem, his presence alone stirred unease. Prophets did not travel without purpose, and the elders of the town felt the weight of his arrival. They came out to meet him, their voices cautious, their eyes searching. "Do you come in peace?" they asked. "In peace," Samuel assured them. He spoke of the sacrifice, of the invitation, of the need for consecration. The tension softened, though not completely. Something significant was happening. They could feel it, even if they did not yet understand it. Jesse was among those called, a man of standing in the community. He came with his sons, each one prepared, each one likely wondering why they had been summoned. There was no indication, at least outwardly, of what was about to unfold. David, meanwhile, was not there. He remained in the fields, as he always had. While his brothers stood in the presence of the prophet, he stood among sheep. While they prepared for something important, he carried on with what had been entrusted to him. No one had thought to call him in. The gathering began. As Jesse presented his sons, Samuel watched carefully. The first to pass before him was Eliab, the eldest. His appearance was striking. Tall, strong, every inch what one might expect in a king. Samuel felt something stir within him. Surely, he thought, the Lord's anointed stands here. It would have made sense. Eliab fit the pattern. He looked the part, carried himself with the confidence of one who belonged in leadership. By all outward measures, he seemed right. But then came the correction, clear, unmistakable. "Do not consider his appearance or his height," the voice of God pressed into Samuel's spirit. "I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." The words shifted everything. One by one, the sons of Jesse passed before Samuel. Abinadab came, then Shammah, then others. Each time Samuel waited, listened, searched for confirmation. Each time the answer was the same, not this one. The tension in the room grew. 7 sons had passed, and still there was no chosen one. Samuel turned to Jesse, confusion now evident in his voice. "Are these all the sons you have?" Jesse hesitated, as if the answer was obvious. "There is still the youngest," he said, almost as an afterthought, "but he is tending the sheep." The youngest, not even present, not considered worth calling in for something this important. In Jesse's mind, perhaps it made sense. What role could the youngest, least experienced son play in such a moment? But Samuel did not move forward. "Send for him," he said firmly. "We will not sit down until he arrives." And so, for the first time that day, David was called. In the fields, the message reached him, likely brief, perhaps urgent. "Leave the sheep, come home. The prophet is here." It would have been an unexpected interruption. There was no reason, from David's perspective, to think this moment was about him. He had been left out from the beginning. Why would that change now? Yet he came. Dust still clung to his clothes, the scent of the fields following him into a space filled with expectation. His brothers were already there, his father watching, the prophet standing at the center of it all. Whatever this was, it was far beyond the ordinary. And then it happened. As David entered, something shifted, not outwardly dramatic, not accompanied by spectacle, but unmistakable. Samuel saw him, and in that instant the confirmation came. "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." There was no hesitation this time. Samuel stepped forward, the horn of oil in his hand. The room, once filled with uncertainty, now held a different kind of silence. Not confusion, but awe. Something sacred was unfolding. Something that would not fully make sense in the moment, but would echo far beyond it. He poured the oil over David's head. It was a simple act, outwardly. Oil running down hair, across forehead, onto shoulders. But spiritually, it marked something profound. This was not just a blessing, it was a calling. A declaration that this overlooked shepherd had been chosen by God for a purpose no one else had seen. And in that moment, something else occurred. Something invisible but powerful. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day forward. There were no immediate changes in circumstance, no crown placed on his head, no throne given to him. He was still the youngest son, still the shepherd, still the one who had been forgotten at the start of the day. But inwardly, everything had changed. He had been seen. Not by the crowd, not by his brothers, not even by his father, but by God. The gathering eventually ended. Samuel departed, returning to his own path, carrying with him the knowledge of what had just been set in motion. Jesse and his sons were left to process what they had witnessed, though it is unlikely any of them fully understood it. And David, he returned to the fields. That may be one of the most striking parts of the story. After being chosen, after being anointed, after receiving the Spirit of God in such a powerful way, he went back to tending sheep. There was no immediate elevation, no sudden shift in status. The calling had come, but the timing of its fulfillment remained unknown. This was the beginning of a new kind of waiting. But it was no longer the same as before. The quiet of the fields now carried a different weight. The same hills, the same sheep, the same solitude, but now infused with purpose. What had once been a place of obscurity had become a place of preparation. David did not yet know how his story would unfold. He did not know the trials that awaited him, the battles he would face, the heights he would reach, or the failures he would endure. But he knew this. He had been chosen, and that truth, once planted in the heart, has a way of sustaining a person through seasons where nothing else seems to change. The world had not yet recognized him, but heaven had. And that was enough to begin. Life did not dramatically change for David in the days immediately following his anointing. If anything, the outward rhythms remained almost identical. The same hills stretched before him each morning. The same flock depended on his care. The same quiet wrapped itself around his days and nights. If someone had passed by and observed him, they would have seen nothing remarkable, just a shepherd doing what he had always done. But something within him had shifted. There are moments in life that do not alter circumstances right away, yet they change the way everything is experienced. David carried the memory of that day. The oil poured over his head, the presence that had come upon him, the undeniable sense that God had seen him, chosen him, marked him for something beyond what he could fully understand. It was not something he spoke of often, if at all. It was something he held quietly, almost reverently in his heart. The solitude of the fields, once simply a place of work, became something deeper. David's songs began to take shape in new ways. What may have once been simple melodies to pass the time grew into expressions of something far more profound. He sang not just about what he saw, but about what he sensed, the nearness of God, the protection he felt in unseen moments, the peace that settled over him even when he stood alone under the vast sky. The harp became his companion in those quiet hours. Its strings responded to his touch, echoing the emotions he could not always put into words. Some days the melodies were soft and reflective, rising gently like the morning light. Other days they carried a quiet strength, shaped by the challenges he faced in guarding the flock. Over time, those songs became more than music. They became a language between his heart and God. Far from the fields, however, a very different kind of atmosphere was growing in the court of Saul. The king who had once stood with confidence and authority was no longer the same. Something within him had begun to unravel. The favor he once carried had lifted, and in its place came a troubling restlessness. It was not a physical ailment that could be easily named or treated. It was deeper than that, an agitation of the spirit, a heaviness that seemed to come and go without warning but never truly left. At times Saul would sit in silence, his thoughts turning inward, his mood darkening without clear cause. At other moments, bursts of anger or despair would surface, leaving those around him uncertain and uneasy. The palace, once a place of structure and order, now held an undercurrent of tension that could not be ignored. Those who served him noticed the change. They spoke quietly among themselves, searching for a solution, something, anything that might bring relief to the king. In that time, music was often used to calm troubled minds, to soothe emotions that could not be easily controlled. One of Saul's servants, perhaps recalling stories heard in passing, spoke up. "Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who plays the harp," he suggested. "He will play when the troubling spirit comes upon you, and you will feel better." It was a simple idea, but one that seemed worth trying. Saul, weary of his own unrest, agreed. "Find me someone who plays well, and bring him to me." And so the search began. It did not take long for word of David to surface. Though he had lived a largely unseen life, he was not entirely unknown. In a small community like Bethlehem, stories traveled, especially when they involved skill or character that stood out. One servant spoke with confidence. "I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the harp. He is brave, a warrior, speaks well, and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him." It is striking how David was described, not just as a musician, but as someone marked by qualities that went beyond his years: courage, presence, ability, and perhaps most importantly, a recognition that something about him carried the favor of God. Saul did not hesitate. Messengers were sent to Jesse with a request: "Send your son David to me, the one who tends the sheep." Once again, David was called from the fields. The transition must have felt sudden, even disorienting. One day he was guiding sheep through familiar hills. The next he was being summoned to stand in the presence of a king. The journey from pasture to palace is not one that happens gradually. It is a sharp shift, a crossing from one world into another. Jesse prepared for the moment as best he could. He sent David with gifts: bread, wine, a young goat, offerings appropriate for someone entering the service of a king. There was likely a mixture of pride and uncertainty in Jesse's heart. His youngest son, once barely considered for important gatherings, was now being called into the royal court. David went. The palace was unlike anything he had known. Where the fields had been open and quiet, the court was structured, filled with movement, voices, expectations. Servants moved with purpose. Guards stood watch. Officials spoke in measured tones. Everything carried a sense of order, but beneath it all lingered that same tension, the unrest that had taken hold of Saul. When David was brought before the king, there was no dramatic introduction. He stood, likely humble, aware of the weight of the moment but not yet fully understanding his place in it. Saul saw him, and something about David found favor in his eyes. It is difficult to explain why certain people stand out in a room, why their presence carries a quiet steadiness that others can sense. David had that quality, not because of position or power, but because of something internal, something shaped in solitude, refined in unseen places. Saul grew fond of him quickly, so much so that he asked Jesse to allow David to remain in his service. And so, the shepherd became part of the palace, but not in the way one might expect. David was not immediately placed in a position of authority. He was not elevated to leadership or given command. His role was simple yet deeply significant. He was to play the harp for the king. When the troubling spirit came upon Saul, when the heaviness returned and unrest filled the room, David would take his place and begin to play. The music would rise, gentle at first, then steady, carrying a peace that seemed to reach beyond the physical sound. The tension in the room would ease. Saul's breathing would slow, the agitation would quiet, if only for a time. There is something powerful about that image. A king, burdened and restless, finding relief through the music of a shepherd boy. David did not argue, did not question why he had been brought there. He simply did what he had always done. He played. What had been cultivated in the quiet fields was now being used in a place of influence, though not in a way that brought attention to himself. This season in the palace was one of quiet positioning. David was close to the throne, yet not on it. He observed, learned, absorbed the dynamics of leadership without carrying its weight. He saw Saul's strengths, but also his weaknesses. He witnessed firsthand what happens when power is not grounded in obedience, when internal unrest begins to shape outward decisions. These were lessons no teacher could have fully conveyed. They had to be seen, experienced, understood over time. And still, David did not remain in the palace permanently. Scripture notes that he went back and forth, from Saul's presence to tending his father's sheep in Bethlehem. This detail is easy to overlook, but it reveals something important. Even as he stepped into a new environment, he remained connected to the place where his foundation had been built. He did not abandon the fields. There is a humility in that, a willingness to continue in what seems small even after being exposed to something greater. It speaks to a heart that does not rush ahead of its season, that does not grasp for position but remains faithful in whatever is placed before it. David's life at this stage was unfolding in layers. In the fields, he continued to grow in character, in dependence on God, in quiet strength. In the palace, he began to understand the complexities of leadership, the weight of authority, the consequences of internal instability. And in both places, he remained the same at his core, a servant, a musician, a man learning to trust God in whatever setting he found himself. He had been anointed, but he was not yet king. He had been chosen, but he was still being prepared. And in that preparation, every moment mattered, whether it took place under the open sky or within the walls of a troubled palace. The journey was unfolding step by step, and though no one could yet see where it would lead, the path was already being shaped with purpose. The valley stretched wide between two opposing armies, its dusty floor bearing the tension of a conflict that had yet to be decided. On one side stood the forces of Israel, led by Saul, their lines drawn but their courage shaken. On the other side, the Philistines loomed, confident and aggressive, their presence pressing heavily against the spirit of Israel's soldiers. Every morning and evening the standoff repeated itself, not with clashing swords, but with something perhaps more unsettling, waiting. At the center of this tension stood a man unlike any other, a warrior whose very presence disrupted the balance of the battlefield. His name was Goliath, a giant both in size and reputation. Clad in armor that gleamed under the harsh sun, he stepped forward day after day, issuing the same challenge with unwavering confidence. His voice carried across the valley like thunder, mocking Israel and daring them to send a champion to face him in single combat. The terms were simple, yet terrifying. One man from Israel would fight him, and the outcome would determine the fate of both armies. Victory would mean dominance, defeat would mean submission. It was a challenge designed not just to win a battle, but to break a people's spirit before the first blow was even struck. And it was working. For 40 days no one stepped forward. The soldiers of Israel, trained for war and accustomed to combat, found themselves paralyzed not by the prospect of fighting, but by the overwhelming presence of this one man. Fear crept into their ranks, not loud or obvious, but persistent and suffocating. Even Saul, once known for his physical stature and leadership, hesitated. The silence from Israel's side became as loud as Goliath's taunts. Far from the battlefield, life continued in Bethlehem, largely untouched by the immediate threat. David remained in his familiar rhythm, moving between tending his father's sheep and serving in the palace when called. He was not a soldier, not part of the army encamped in the valley. The war for him was something distant, until it wasn't. One day his father Jesse called him in with a task that seemed ordinary enough. He handed David provisions, grain, bread and cheese, and gave him instructions to bring them to his brothers who were stationed with the army. It was a simple errand, the kind David had likely done before. There was no indication that this journey would become anything more than a delivery. David rose early and set out, leaving the flock in the care of another. The road to the battlefield carried him from the quiet familiarity of the hills into an environment thick with anticipation and unease. As he approached the camp, he could hear the sounds of movement, soldiers preparing, voices calling out, the clatter of armor being adjusted. He arrived just as the armies were taking their positions. Israel stood on one side of the valley, the Philistines on the other, the space between them heavy with expectation. David left his supplies with the keeper of provisions and ran to greet his brothers, eager to see them and deliver the items his father had sent. As he spoke with them, the familiar pattern unfolded once again. Goliath stepped forward. His voice rose above the noise of the camp, issuing the same challenge, the same taunt, the same defiance that had echoed for weeks. The words were not new, but the effect remained powerful. Fear rippled through the ranks of Israel, visible in the shifting posture of soldiers, in the way their voices lowered, in the absence of anyone willing to respond. But this time, someone heard it differently. David listened, his expression shifting not to fear, but to something closer to disbelief. It was not the size of Goliath that caught his attention, nor the weight of the challenge itself. It was the nature of the words being spoken. Goliath was not merely challenging Israel, he was defying the living God. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine," David asked, "that he should defy the armies of the living God?" The question carried a tone that stood in stark contrast to the atmosphere around him. Where others saw an unbeatable opponent, David saw an affront that could not go unanswered. Where fear had taken root in the hearts of seasoned warriors, something else stirred within him. Conviction. The men around him responded with a mixture of explanation and quiet frustration. They spoke of the reward offered by Saul to anyone who would defeat Goliath. Wealth, honor, even marriage into the royal family. Yet their words carried no sense of possibility. The reward felt distant, almost irrelevant, compared to the reality of the challenge. David's questions continued, not out of ignorance, but out of a refusal to accept the situation as it was. His voice, though not loud, carried a clarity that began to draw attention. That attention reached his eldest brother, Eliab. Eliab's reaction was not one of support or agreement. Instead, it was sharp, dismissive, laced with irritation. "Why have you come down here?" he demanded. "And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the evil of your heart. You came down only to watch the battle." The words cut, not because they were true, but because they reflected how David had often been seen. The youngest, the overlooked one, the shepherd whose place was not among warriors. Eliab could not see beyond what he had always believed about his brother. David's response was measured. "What have I done now?" he asked. "Can't I even speak?" There was no argument, no attempt to prove himself. He simply turned away and continued to speak with others, his focus unchanged. The dismissal of his brother did not alter what he had heard, nor what he believed should happen. Word of David's remarks began to spread. In a camp where fear had silenced most voices, someone speaking with confidence, especially someone unexpected, stood out. Eventually, the report reached Saul himself. Curious, perhaps even desperate, the king sent for David. Standing before Saul, David did not present himself as a seasoned warrior. He did not rely on status or experience. Instead, he spoke with a quiet certainty that seemed to come from somewhere deeper. "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine," he said. "Your servant will go and fight him." Saul's response was immediate and logical. "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him," he said. "You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." By every measurable standard, Saul was right. But David's confidence was not rooted in those standards. He spoke of the fields, of the lions and bears that had threatened his flock. He spoke of the times he had pursued them, struck them, rescued the sheep from their mouths. These were not stories told to impress, but experiences that had shaped his understanding of what was possible. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear," David said, "will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." There was no arrogance in his voice, only trust. Something in those words, perhaps the conviction behind them, shifted Saul's stance. Whether out of belief or lack of better options, he relented. "Go," he said, "and the Lord be with you." Saul offered his own armor, placing it on David in an attempt to prepare him for the battle. But the weight of it, the unfamiliarity, the restriction it caused, made it clear that this was not the way. David removed it. He chose instead what he knew: a staff, a sling, and 5 smooth stones from the stream. It was not the equipment of a warrior, but it was the tool of a shepherd, and it was enough. As he stepped onto the battlefield, the contrast between him and Goliath was unmistakable. The giant moved forward, his armor gleaming, his shield-bearer before him. When he saw David, his reaction was one of contempt. This was not the opponent he expected. This was not a warrior worthy of his challenge. "Am I a dog," Goliath mocked, "that you come at me with sticks?" His curses followed, loud and filled with disdain. But David did not respond in kind. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin," he said, "but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." The words were not a declaration of personal strength, but of divine authority. David was not stepping forward as an individual seeking glory. He was stepping forward in defense of something greater. The moment did not stretch out. As Goliath advanced, David moved quickly. Reaching into his bag, he took a stone, placed it in his sling, and swung it with practiced precision. The motion was fluid, familiar, shaped by years in the fields. The stone flew. It struck Goliath in the forehead, sinking deep. The giant staggered, then fell forward, his massive frame hitting the ground with a force that echoed across the valley. Silence followed. For a brief moment, the battlefield held its breath. Then realization broke through. David ran forward, stood over Goliath, and used the giant's own sword to complete the victory. It was decisive, unmistakable. The Philistines, seeing their champion fall, turned and fled. The army of Israel, once paralyzed by fear, surged forward with renewed courage, pursuing their enemies and reclaiming ground that had felt lost. What had seemed impossible hours before had been overturned in a single moment, but the significance of that moment extended far beyond the battlefield. David, the overlooked shepherd, had stepped into a space where others hesitated and had acted with a confidence rooted not in himself, but in his trust in God. The victory was not just over a giant, it was over fear, over doubt, over the belief that what stood in front of them could not be overcome. As the dust settled and the echoes of battle faded, one thing became clear. The quiet life in the fields had prepared David for this moment, and this moment would begin to change everything. The valley had fallen silent after the clash, but the echo of what had happened there continued to ripple outward, reaching every corner of Israel with a force that could not be contained. And at the center of it all stood David, no longer just a shepherd or a quiet musician in the court, but now a name spoken with awe, curiosity, and growing admiration, as the boy who had faced Goliath and emerged victorious carried with him a story that people could not stop repeating. And as he was brought again before Saul after the battle, still holding the weight of that moment, yet seemingly unchanged in his humility, something significant began to unfold that would shape the course of his life in ways he could not yet foresee, because among those who witnessed or heard of what had happened was Saul's son, Jonathan, a man already known for his courage and loyalty, who saw in David not just a warrior, but something deeper, something familiar, as though the same fire of faith and conviction that had led him into his own acts of bravery now stood before him in another. And it is said that from that moment the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, forming a bond that went beyond circumstance or advantage, a connection not rooted in power or position but in shared belief and mutual respect. And Jonathan, recognizing the significance of what stood before him, did something remarkable. He took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his armor, even his sword, bow and belt, a gesture that was not merely symbolic but deeply meaningful, as it reflected a surrender of status and a recognition that David's future would be greater than his own. And while such an act could have been driven by political calculation in another setting, here it flowed from genuine love and trust, establishing a friendship that would stand in contrast to the tension that was quietly beginning to grow elsewhere. Because as David remained in Saul's service and began to go out with the army, leading missions and returning with success, the people of Israel took notice in a way that went beyond appreciation. Their admiration began to take shape in words that carried unintended consequences, and as the soldiers returned from battle, as victories stacked upon victories, the streets filled with celebration, with music and dancing, with voices lifted in songs that praised what had been accomplished. And among those voices were women who sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." A simple line, perhaps meant to honor both king and warrior, but one that struck Saul in a way that stirred something dark within him. Because where others heard praise, Saul heard comparison. And where there is comparison, there is often insecurity. And what began as a seed of discomfort quickly took root in his heart, growing into jealousy that clouded his perception. What more can he get but the kingdom, Saul thought. And from that moment on, he watched David with a different eye, no longer seeing him as a servant who brought peace through music or a loyal subject who fought for Israel, but as a threat, someone whose rising influence might one day challenge his own position. And it is here that the contrast between Jonathan and Saul becomes even more striking, because while Jonathan saw David and chose to love him, Saul saw David and chose to fear him, and fear, when left unchecked, has a way of distorting reality, turning allies into enemies and trust into suspicion. And so even as David continued to serve faithfully, unaware of the full extent of what was building within Saul, the atmosphere around him began to shift. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but growing steadily, and there were moments when that inner turmoil in Saul surfaced in sudden, unpredictable ways, such as when the troubling spirit returned and David played the harp as he had done before, filling the room with music meant to calm and restore. Yet instead of peace, something else rose within Saul, a surge of anger, of frustration, of something that no longer responded to what once brought relief. And in a moment that would have seemed unthinkable not long before, Saul took a spear in his hand and hurled it toward David, intending to pin him to the wall. But David moved quickly, evading the attack, and the moment passed, though the meaning of it could not be ignored, because what had once been a place of safety had become a place of danger. And yet even in that, David did not retaliate, did not confront Saul with anger or demand justice, but continued to serve, navigating a reality that was becoming increasingly unstable. And still, despite Saul's growing hostility, David found favor among the people and success in his endeavors, because every mission he was sent on ended well. Every challenge met with courage and skill that seemed beyond his years, and this only intensified Saul's fear, creating a cycle where the more David succeeded, the more Saul felt threatened, and the more threatened he felt, the more he sought ways to diminish or remove David, even attempting to manipulate circumstances by offering his daughters in marriage under conditions that were meant to put David in harm's way, hoping that the dangers of battle would accomplish what he himself had not been able to do directly. Yet each attempt only resulted in further success for David, further favor from the people, and deeper frustration for Saul. While through it all, Jonathan remained steadfast, his loyalty to David unwavering even as it placed him in a difficult position between his father and his friend, because to stand with David meant, in some sense, to stand against the direction Saul was moving. And yet Jonathan chose that path, valuing what was right over what was easy, and in quiet moments he would speak with David, strengthening him, reminding him of what had been promised, encouraging him to hold on even as the situation grew more complex. And in those conversations, the depth of their friendship became clear, not built on convenience but on covenant, a commitment that would endure beyond changing circumstances. And so this chapter of David's life unfolds as one of both connection and conflict, of a friendship that brings strength and a jealousy that brings danger, of a rising reputation that opens doors and a growing tension that threatens to close them. And in the midst of it all, David continues forward, not fully aware of how these opposing forces will shape his path, but already stepping into a reality where being chosen does not mean being free from challenge, where favor does not eliminate opposition, and where the journey toward what has been promised often leads through places of testing. And as the songs of the people continue to echo and the eyes of the king continue to watch, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The story is no longer unfolding quietly in the background. It has moved into the center of attention, and with that attention comes both opportunity and risk, setting the stage for what will come next. The shift from tension to open danger did not happen all at once, but for David it became increasingly clear that the environment he once navigated with quiet confidence had changed into something far more volatile, as the favor he had found in the eyes of Saul was steadily replaced by suspicion, resentment, and a growing determination to remove him altogether. And though David continued to serve with the same humility and faithfulness that had marked his life from the beginning, the king's internal unrest had reached a point where reason no longer held its place, where every success David experienced was interpreted not as a benefit to the kingdom, but as a threat to Saul's authority. And so the attempts to harm David, once sudden and isolated, became more deliberate, more calculated, and more frequent, as Saul began to devise ways to place David in situations where danger would accomplish what his own hand had failed to do. Yet even these plans seemed to unravel in unexpected ways, as David continued to succeed in battle, earning greater respect from the people, and further deepening Saul's fear, creating a tension that could no longer be contained within private moments but began to spill into public actions. And it is in this season that the divide between David and Saul becomes undeniable, not merely a difference in perspective but a complete fracture of trust. As Saul's intentions shifted from controlling David's influence to ending his life, and David, though aware of the danger, did not immediately abandon his place, perhaps holding on to the hope that the king's hostility might pass as it had before, or perhaps unwilling to act against the one he still recognized as the Lord's anointed. But the situation reached a point where even those closest to Saul could no longer ignore what was happening, including his son Jonathan, whose loyalty to David placed him in a position of deep internal conflict, as he loved his father yet recognized the injustice unfolding before him. And in a moment of clarity and courage, Jonathan spoke to Saul, reminding him of David's faithfulness, of the victory over Goliath that had brought deliverance to Israel, of the fact that David had done nothing to deserve such treatment. And for a brief moment Saul seemed to listen, even swearing an oath that David would not be put to death, offering a glimpse of hope that the storm might pass. And for a time it appeared that peace had been restored, as David returned to serve in the palace, to play his harp, to go out with the army, continuing in the same pattern that had defined his life since entering Saul's service. But the underlying instability had not truly been resolved, and it did not take long for the troubling spirit to return, bringing with it the same agitation, the same darkness that clouded Saul's judgment. And once again, as David played, seeking to bring calm through music, Saul took up his spear and, with a force driven not by reason but by inner turmoil, hurled it toward him, attempting to strike him down. But David, now more aware of the danger, moved swiftly and escaped, leaving the palace behind not as a servant returning to the fields, but as a man fleeing for his life. And this moment marked a turning point, as the threat was no longer hidden behind attempts or schemes. It was direct, undeniable, and David could no longer remain in the presence of the king without risking everything. And so began a season of movement, of urgency, of seeking safety in a reality that had suddenly become unstable. As David went to Jonathan, sharing what had happened, seeking understanding, perhaps even reassurance that the situation had not escalated as far as it seemed. But Jonathan, though reluctant to believe that his father would go so far, agreed to test the matter, setting in motion a plan that would reveal Saul's true intentions. And during a feast where David's absence would be noted, Jonathan observed his father's reaction, and when Saul realized that David was not present, his anger flared openly, no longer restrained, as he spoke not only against David but against Jonathan himself, accusing him of siding with the one he now saw as an enemy. And in that moment any doubt was removed, as Saul's hostility was laid bare, even to his own son. And Jonathan, deeply grieved by what he had witnessed, went out to meet David in the field, communicating through a prearranged signal that the danger was real and that David must leave. And what followed was not just a strategic separation, but an emotional one, as the two men who had formed such a deep bond were forced apart under the weight of circumstances beyond their control, embracing, weeping, aware that the path ahead would not allow them to walk side by side as they had before. And Jonathan, despite everything, reaffirmed his covenant with David, acknowledging what he believed to be God's purpose for his life, even if it meant stepping aside from his own position. And David, receiving both the warning and the affirmation, stepped into a new reality, one that would define the next chapter of his life, not as a rising figure within the kingdom, but as a fugitive moving from place to place, seeking refuge, carrying with him not only the promise of what had been spoken over him, but also the weight of being pursued by the very king he had once served faithfully. And in this transition, the contrast between calling and circumstance becomes even more pronounced, as David, though anointed, finds himself in a position that appears to contradict everything that has been promised, forced to navigate a path where trust must deepen in the absence of visible progress, where obedience must continue even when it leads away from safety, and where the lessons learned in the quiet fields now become essential for survival in a far more complex and dangerous world. And as he moves forward, leaving behind the familiarity of the palace, the comfort of structured life, and even the presence of those he trusts most, one truth remains steady beneath the uncertainty: the same God who saw him in the fields, who chose him when no one else did, who was with him in the valley against Goliath, is still with him now, even as the path leads into the unknown. And though the story has taken a turn that few would have expected, it is far from over, as this season of pursuit will become one of refinement, shaping David not only into a leader but into a man who understands what it means to trust God when everything else is stripped away. The transition from servant to fugitive was not gradual for David, but abrupt and disorienting, as the stability he had once known was replaced almost overnight with uncertainty, movement, and the constant awareness that he was no longer safe within the borders of his own nation. And though he carried with him the memory of his anointing and the victories that had brought him recognition, those things did not shield him from the reality that he was now being pursued by Saul, a king whose authority extended across the land and whose determination to eliminate David had hardened into something relentless. And so the young man who had once moved freely between the fields and the palace now found himself navigating a life defined by caution, strategy, and the need to remain unseen, beginning with his escape to Nob, where he sought refuge with the priest Ahimelech, arriving alone, weary, and likely still trying to process how quickly everything had changed. And when questioned about his presence, David spoke in a way that concealed the full truth, not out of malice but out of necessity, as he requested provisions and received consecrated bread, the only food available, along with the sword of Goliath, which had been kept there, a reminder of a past victory now repurposed for survival. And yet even in this moment, there were signs that his situation was more fragile than it appeared. As Doeg the Edomite, a servant of Saul, observed the interaction, a detail that would later carry consequences far beyond what David could have anticipated. And from there David continued his flight, crossing into territory that would have once been considered hostile, seeking refuge among the Philistines in Gath, the very people he had once fought against, a move that reflects the depth of his desperation as the boundaries that once defined friend and enemy blurred under the pressure of survival. Yet even there, his reputation followed him, as the servants of Achish recognized him, recalling the songs that had been sung about his victories. And David, realizing the danger of being identified in a place where he had no allies, resorted to behavior that might have seemed unthinkable under other circumstances, feigning madness, allowing his appearance and actions to create the impression that he was no threat, a strategy that ultimately led to his dismissal rather than his capture. And so he escaped once again, this time to the cave of Adullam, a place of isolation that would become something entirely different over time, because it was there, in that hidden space, that others began to gather around him, not the strong or the influential, but those who were distressed, in debt or discontented, individuals who, like David, found themselves on the margins, carrying burdens that had left them searching for something more. And though this group may not have seemed like the foundation of anything significant, it was in this unlikely assembly that David began to step into a different kind of leadership, not over a structured army or a defined role, but over people whose lives were marked by struggle, requiring patience, understanding, and a willingness to lead without the support of established systems. And as their numbers grew, reaching about 400 men, the cave transformed from a place of refuge into a base of operation where David learned to navigate not only external threats but also the complexities of guiding others, making decisions that affected more than just himself. And during this time, his concern extended beyond his own safety, as he sought to ensure the protection of his family, bringing his parents to the king of Moab, and asking that they be allowed to stay there until he could determine what would happen next. A decision that reflects both his sense of responsibility and the uncertainty that continued to define his path. And yet, even in the midst of this instability, there were moments where direction came with clarity, such as when the prophet Gad instructed him not to remain in the stronghold, but to return to the land of Judah, a command that required trust, as it meant moving back into territory where Saul's influence was strongest. Yet David obeyed, demonstrating that his actions were not driven solely by strategy but by a desire to remain aligned with God's guidance. And this pattern would continue to define his journey as he balanced the practical realities of survival with a deeper commitment to trust. And as news reached him of the Philistines attacking Keilah, David sought direction once again, asking whether he should go and fight them. And despite the risks, he received confirmation to act, leading his men to deliver the city, a victory that reinforced his role as a protector of Israel, even while being pursued by its king. Yet the outcome did not bring security, as David soon learned that Saul was planning to come to Keilah, viewing the situation as an opportunity to trap him. And so David inquired again, seeking to understand whether the people of the city he had just saved would hand him over. And when the answer came that they would, he did not hesitate to leave, recognizing that loyalty in such circumstances could not be assumed. And so the pattern continued, moving from place to place, from wilderness to stronghold, from one temporary refuge to another, as Saul pursued him with increasing intensity, treating him not as a former servant but as an enemy to be captured or killed. And yet, even in this prolonged season of being hunted, David's character remained consistent as he refrained from taking matters into his own hands in ways that would compromise his values, choosing instead to endure, to wait, to trust that the path he was on, though difficult, was not without purpose. And in the wilderness of Ziph, where the landscape itself reflected the harshness of his circumstances, Jonathan found him once more, strengthening him in God and reminding him of what had been promised. A brief but powerful moment of encouragement that reaffirmed the connection between them and provided David with the resolve to continue, even as the separation between them would soon become permanent. And as Saul continued his search, closing in at times with alarming proximity, there were moments where it seemed that capture was inevitable, such as when Saul and his forces surrounded the mountain where David and his men were hiding, the distance between them narrowing to a point where escape appeared impossible. Yet in a turn that could only be described as providential, a message reached Saul that the Philistines were attacking elsewhere, forcing him to withdraw and leaving David free to move once again. And in these moments the pattern becomes clear that even when circumstances seem to align against him, there was a protection at work that could not be attributed to chance alone, guiding him through situations where the outcome could have easily been different. And so this chapter of David's life unfolds as one of constant movement, of living without the security of a fixed place, of leading a group formed out of hardship, and of learning to trust in ways that go beyond what is visible, as the promise of what he would one day become stands in stark contrast to the reality of what he is currently experiencing. And yet it is within this tension that something essential is being formed, shaping him not just as a leader but as a man who understands reliance on God in the absence of certainty, who learns to act with integrity even when wronged, and who continues forward despite the weight of being pursued, knowing that the story is still unfolding, even if the path ahead remains unclear. The wilderness had become both refuge and testing ground for David, a place where survival demanded constant awareness and where every decision carried weight not only for himself, but for the men who had gathered around him. And as the pursuit by Saul continued with unwavering intensity, the lines between hunter and hunted sharpened with each passing day, shaping a reality in which David was forced to navigate terrain that was as unpredictable as the circumstances that had driven him there. Moving from stronghold to wilderness, from forest to desert, always aware that Saul's forces were never far behind. And it was in this environment of tension and movement that one of the most defining moments of David's character would emerge, not through battle or victory, but through restraint, through a decision that would reveal the depth of his trust and the nature of his heart. Because there came a time when Saul, still searching for David, entered the region of En-Gedi, a place marked by rugged cliffs and hidden caves that offered both concealment and danger. And as Saul pursued with 3,000 chosen men, a number that underscored both his determination and the imbalance between the two sides, he found himself in a moment of vulnerability that he could not have anticipated as he entered a cave to rest, unaware that deeper within that very cave, David and his men were hiding, pressed into the shadows, watching in silence as the one who had been relentlessly hunting them now stood within reach. And the significance of that moment was not lost on those around David, as his men recognized what appeared to be a providential opportunity, a turning point that could end the pursuit once and for all, whispering to him that this was the day the Lord had spoken of, that Saul had been delivered into his hands, that now was the time to act, to strike, to remove the threat and claim the freedom that had been denied for so long. And from a purely practical perspective, their reasoning was sound, because eliminating Saul would not only secure David's safety, but would also align with what had already been spoken over his life. As the one anointed to be king, yet what seems logical in one sense can conflict deeply with conviction in another, and David, though aware of the opportunity before him, did not respond in the way his men expected, instead moving quietly, carefully, approaching Saul not with the intent to kill, but with a different purpose entirely, cutting off a corner of Saul's robe as a silent act that would later serve as evidence. Yet even this small action stirred something within him, as his conscience was struck, reminding him that even in this restrained act, he had touched something that represented the authority God had established. And in that moment, David made a decision that would define not only the outcome of the situation, but the direction of his own heart, refusing to harm Saul, declaring to his men that he would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Recognizing that while Saul's actions had been unjust and his pursuit relentless, his position had been established by God, and therefore it was not David's place to remove him, a stance that required a level of restraint that went against both instinct and opportunity, especially in a context where his own life was at risk. Yet David held firm, choosing to trust that the timing and unfolding of events would remain in God's hands, rather than taking control through force. And after Saul left the cave, unaware of how close he had come to losing his life, David stepped out and called after him, revealing himself not with hostility but with clarity, bowing before the king and presenting the piece of the robe as evidence of what had transpired, speaking in a way that was both respectful and direct, addressing Saul's actions without returning them in kind, questioning why he had listened to those who claimed David sought to harm him, and demonstrating through his restraint that his intentions were not driven by rebellion or ambition, but by a desire to remain faithful even in the face of injustice. And the impact of this moment was profound, as Saul, confronted not by an attack but by mercy, was moved in a way that broke through the hardness that had defined his pursuit, acknowledging that David had treated him better than he had been treated, recognizing the righteousness of David's actions, and even admitting that David would one day be king, a confession that stood in stark contrast to the fear and jealousy that had fueled his behavior. And for a moment, the tension that had defined their relationship softened, as Saul asked David to swear that he would not cut off his descendants or erase his name, a request that revealed both an awareness of what was to come and a desire to preserve something of his legacy. And David agreed, honoring the request without using the moment to assert his own position. And yet, despite this temporary resolution, the underlying reality had not fully changed, because while Saul's words reflected a moment of clarity, they did not necessarily indicate a permanent transformation, and David, understanding this, did not return to live under Saul's authority, but instead remained in the strongholds, continuing to navigate a life that required both caution and trust. And in this entire encounter, the significance extends beyond the immediate outcome, because it reveals something essential about David's character, that he was not driven by opportunity alone, not willing to achieve what had been promised through means that compromised his convictions, but instead chose to wait, to trust that the path to what had been spoken over his life would not require him to step outside of the principles that had guided him thus far. And this decision, though it may have seemed like a missed opportunity from an external perspective, was in fact a defining moment of integrity, shaping the kind of leader he would become, one who understood that power gained through force alone does not carry the same weight as authority established through faithfulness. And so as the wilderness continued to stretch before him, as the pursuit would inevitably resume in one form or another, David carried with him not only the experience of being spared in his own moments of vulnerability, but also the knowledge that he had chosen mercy when given the chance for revenge, a choice that would echo through the rest of his journey, reinforcing the truth that being chosen does not eliminate the need for restraint, and that sometimes the greatest victories are not those won in battle, but those won within the heart, where the decision to trust, to wait, and to act with integrity defines the path forward, even when easier options present themselves. The wilderness had already shaped David in ways few could fully understand, yet even within that season of constant movement and tension, there came a moment that marked a different kind of shift, one not defined by pursuit or escape, but by loss. As word reached him that Samuel had died, the same prophet who had once stood in Jesse's house and anointed David with oil, marking him for a future he had not yet stepped into. And though much time had passed since that moment, and their paths had not often crossed since, Samuel's presence had remained a quiet anchor in the background of David's life, a reminder that his calling had not been imagined, that it had been spoken and confirmed, and now that voice was gone, leaving behind a silence that carried weight beyond the loss of a man, because Samuel represented something more than guidance. He represented connection to the beginning of David's story, and with his passing there was a sense that a chapter had closed, forcing David to move forward without that source of reassurance. And as the nation gathered to mourn, David remained in the wilderness, unable to participate openly in what was happening, continuing to live in a reality that separated him from the broader life of Israel. And yet, even as he processed this loss, the demands of his current circumstances did not pause, as the wilderness required constant attention, and it was in this setting that another situation arose, one that would test David's response not to an enemy like Saul, but to a different kind of challenge, involving a man named Nabal, whose wealth was considerable, but whose character stood in sharp contrast to the generosity that such wealth might have supported. And as David and his men moved through the region, they had acted as a form of protection for Nabal's shepherds, ensuring that no harm came to them or their flocks, a quiet service that went unrecorded in any formal sense but was understood by those who experienced it. And when the time came for sheep shearing, a season often associated with celebration and generosity, David sent messengers to Nabal with a respectful request for provisions, not as a demand but as an appeal based on the goodwill that had been shown. Yet Nabal's response was dismissive and harsh, rejecting David's request and speaking in a way that disregarded both the service that had been provided and the position David held, referring to him as just another runaway servant, a comment that struck at the heart of David's current reality, reducing his experience to something lesser, ignoring both his past and his calling. And when the messengers returned and relayed these words, something within David shifted, as the accumulated weight of loss, of being pursued, of navigating constant uncertainty, now met with this insult, and for a moment his response moved toward action driven by emotion rather than restraint, as he instructed his men to strap on their swords, preparing to confront Nabal with a force that would have resulted in destruction. A decision that stood in contrast to the mercy he had shown in the cave, revealing that even a man shaped by faith and experience could still be pulled toward reaction when circumstances aligned in certain ways. Yet even as this plan moved forward, another voice entered the situation, that of Abigail, Nabal's wife, whose awareness of what was unfolding and whose understanding of the potential consequences led her to act quickly and decisively, gathering provisions and going out to meet David before he could reach her household. And when she encountered him, her approach was marked by humility and wisdom, speaking not in defense of her husband's actions but in acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done, taking responsibility in a way that diffused the tension, and appealing to David's deeper sense of identity, reminding him of who he was and who he was called to be, cautioning him against taking vengeance into his own hands, and encouraging him to consider the long-term impact of his actions. And her words reached him in a way that halted the course he had set, bringing him back from the edge of a decision that would have contradicted the very principles he had upheld. And in that moment, David recognized the significance of what had occurred, not only the immediate outcome but the intervention that had prevented him from acting out of anger, blessing Abigail for her discernment and acknowledging that her presence had kept him from shedding blood unnecessarily. And so the situation resolved without violence, as David accepted the provisions and turned away, allowing the matter to unfold without his direct involvement. And shortly after, when Nabal's actions and condition led to his death, the resolution came not through David's hand but through circumstances beyond his control, reinforcing the lesson that justice does not always require personal execution, and that restraint, even when difficult, can align with a larger purpose. And in the aftermath, David took Abigail as his wife, a development that added another layer to his life, bringing both companionship and a connection to a moment that had tested his judgment. Yet even within these personal developments, the broader reality remained unchanged, as Saul's pursuit had not ended, and David's position continued to be one of movement and uncertainty, navigating relationships, responsibilities, and threats in a way that required constant awareness. And in this chapter, the interplay between loss and loyalty becomes evident, as David processes the absence of Samuel, responds to the actions of Nabal, and listens to the counsel of Abigail, all while maintaining a commitment to something greater than immediate reaction. And it is within this complexity that his character continues to be refined, learning not only how to lead others but how to govern his own responses, recognizing that the path toward what has been promised is not defined solely by external victories but by internal decisions. And as the wilderness stretches on and the future remains just out of reach, David continues forward, carrying with him both the memory of those who have shaped him and the lessons learned in moments where his own choices have been tested, knowing that the story is still unfolding and that each decision, whether seen or unseen, contributes to the man he is becoming. The tension that had stretched across years of pursuit, conflict, and restraint was slowly drawing toward a breaking point. Though for David, the final moments of that chapter would come not through confrontation, but through news carried from a battlefield he was not part of, as the unfolding events surrounding Saul reached their conclusion far from where David stood. And yet the impact would reach him deeply, shaping both his present and his future in ways that could not be ignored. Because while David remained in the wilderness, continuing to navigate the fragile balance between survival and purpose, the Philistines once again gathered their forces, preparing for battle against Israel, a conflict that would not merely test strength but would determine the direction of the nation's leadership. And Saul, whose reign had been marked by both early promise and later instability, found himself facing not only an external enemy but an internal reality that had long been building, as the distance between him and God, once subtle, had become undeniable, leaving him without the clarity and assurance that had once guided his decisions. And in this state of uncertainty, Saul sought answers in ways that reflected his desperation, turning to sources he had once opposed, seeking guidance where it could not truly be found, an act that revealed the depth of his fear and the extent to which he had lost the sense of direction that had once defined his leadership. And as the Philistine army advanced and the reality of the impending battle became unavoidable, Saul's position grew increasingly fragile, not only because of the strength of his enemies, but because of the absence of the confidence that comes from alignment with God. And so the stage was set for a confrontation that would bring this chapter of Israel's history to a close, as the armies met on Mount Gilboa, the clash that followed marked by intensity and consequence, with the forces of Israel struggling under the weight of the attack, their lines breaking, their resistance faltering, and in the midst of the chaos, Saul's sons, including Jonathan, fought with the courage that had defined them, yet even their bravery could not alter the outcome. As Jonathan fell in battle, a loss that carried both personal and national significance, removing from the story a figure whose loyalty and character had stood in contrast to the turmoil surrounding his father. And as the battle continued to turn against Israel, Saul himself found his position compromised, wounded and surrounded, facing a reality from which there was no clear escape. And in that moment, the weight of his journey, of the choices that had led him there, converged, leading him to a final decision that would end his life, falling on his own sword rather than being captured, an act that brought his reign to a close in a manner that reflected the complexity and tragedy of his story. And with his death, along with that of his sons, the leadership of Israel entered a moment of transition, one that would inevitably intersect with David's path, though not in the way one might expect, because when the news reached David, it did not come with celebration or relief, but with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief, carried by a messenger who arrived with signs of mourning, reporting the events of the battle and the deaths that had occurred. And for David, the response was immediate and profound, as he tore his clothes and mourned, not only for Jonathan, his friend, but also for Saul, the king who had pursued him, the one he had refused to harm when given the opportunity, the one whose life had been intertwined with his own in ways both painful and significant. And this reaction reveals something essential about David's character, that he did not interpret Saul's death as a victory for himself, but as a loss for Israel, as a moment that called for grief rather than triumph. And in the days that followed, David composed a lament, a song that would preserve the memory of Saul and Jonathan, honoring their strength, their contributions, and the role they had played in the life of the nation, speaking of them not through the lens of personal conflict but through the recognition of their place in the story of Israel. And in doing so, he demonstrated a capacity to separate personal experience from collective significance, to honor what was worthy even in the presence of what had been difficult. And this act of mourning was not merely symbolic, but deeply rooted in his understanding of leadership and legacy, acknowledging that the fall of Saul marked the end of an era, one that had begun with hope and had been shaped by both achievement and failure. And as David processed this transition, the reality of what lay ahead began to take shape, because the throne that had once seemed distant, obscured by years of pursuit and uncertainty, was now within reach. Yet even in this moment, David did not rush forward to claim it, but instead sought direction, asking where he should go, demonstrating once again that his actions were guided not by opportunity alone, but by a desire to remain aligned with God's timing. And when the answer came to go to Hebron, he moved accordingly, taking with him those who had been with him through the wilderness, along with his family, stepping into a new phase of his life that would begin not with immediate unity, but with a divided kingdom, as the transition from Saul's reign to David's leadership would unfold gradually, shaped by both support and resistance. And so this chapter closes not with a moment of conquest, but with a moment of reflection as the life of Saul comes to an end, leaving behind a legacy that is both complex and instructive. And as David stands at the threshold of what has been promised, he does so not with a sense of entitlement, but with an awareness of the responsibility that lies ahead, carrying with him the lessons of the wilderness, the memory of those who have fallen, and the understanding that the path forward will require the same trust and integrity that have brought him to this point. As the story moves into a new phase, one that will test him in different ways, but will continue to reveal the depth of what it means to lead with a heart aligned to God, even in the midst of change and uncertainty. The weight of transition settled over the land like a quiet but undeniable shift in the air, as the death of Saul left Israel without a central figure to unify its tribes. And though the path before David had been foretold years earlier in a moment that had once seemed distant and almost abstract, it now stood directly in front of him, no longer an idea or a promise spoken in private, but a reality that demanded action. And yet, even with that clarity, David did not move forward driven by ambition or assumption, because the years in the wilderness had shaped him into someone who understood that timing mattered just as much as calling. And so rather than taking immediate control or positioning himself in a way that forced recognition, he paused, sought direction, and waited for confirmation of where he should go, a decision that reflected not hesitation but discipline, an understanding that the next step would set the tone for everything that followed. And when the answer came to go to Hebron, a city within the territory of Judah, David gathered those who had been with him through the long season of exile, the men who had stood beside him in caves and strongholds, who had followed him not because of position but because of belief. And along with them he brought his family and those connected to him, moving from the uncertainty of constant flight into a place that would become the starting point of his reign. And as he arrived in Hebron, the people of Judah recognized what had been growing over time, acknowledging not only his past victories but his character, his leadership, and the sense that he was the one meant to guide them. And so in a moment that carried both significance and humility, they anointed him as king over the house of Judah, a step that fulfilled part of what had been spoken over his life but did not yet complete it. Because while David now held a position of authority, it was not over all of Israel but only over one tribe, marking the beginning of a divided kingdom where allegiance was not unified, and where the process of becoming king over the entire nation would unfold gradually, shaped by both acceptance and resistance. And this division was not merely political but deeply rooted in loyalty, as Abner, the commander of Saul's army, took it upon himself to establish a continuation of Saul's line by placing his son Ishbosheth on the throne over the remaining tribes, creating a parallel leadership that stood in opposition to David's rule. And so the land found itself in a state of tension, not open war at every moment, but an underlying conflict that influenced decisions, alliances, and movements, as two centers of authority existed simultaneously, each with its own supporters, each navigating a reality where unity had not yet been restored. And in this environment, David's leadership began to take shape in a way that reflected the lessons he had learned, because rather than asserting dominance through immediate force, he governed Judah with a sense of patience and stability, building trust among the people, establishing a foundation that was not based solely on power but on relationship and integrity. And one of his first actions as king revealed this approach clearly as he reached out to the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had shown loyalty to Saul by retrieving his body and giving him a proper burial. And instead of viewing them as aligned with a rival or treating their actions with suspicion, David honored them, acknowledging their kindness and expressing his desire that they would now support him. A gesture that demonstrated both respect for the past and an openness to the future, signaling that his leadership would not be defined by vengeance or division, but by a willingness to recognize what was good even in those who had been connected to Saul. And yet, despite these efforts, the broader conflict could not be avoided entirely, as the tension between the house of Saul and the house of David eventually led to confrontation, with Abner leading forces against David's men, resulting in a battle at the Pool of Gibeon that began with a controlled contest but quickly escalated into a full-scale conflict. And though David's men gained the upper hand, the cost was not insignificant, as lives were lost and the reality of division became more pronounced. And among those affected was Asahel, the brother of Joab, whose pursuit of Abner led to his death, an event that would later influence decisions and relationships in ways that extended beyond the immediate moment. And as the struggle between the two houses continued, the narrative of David's rise was not one of immediate triumph, but of gradual strengthening, as it is noted that his position grew stronger while the house of Saul grew weaker, a shift that did not occur overnight but unfolded over time, shaped by a combination of events, choices, and the natural movement of allegiance as people observed the direction in which leadership was heading. And within David's own household, life continued to develop, as he took additional wives and had sons born to him in Hebron, expanding his family and establishing a lineage that would carry forward his legacy. Yet even these personal developments existed within the larger context of a nation still in transition, where unity had not yet been achieved, and where the path toward becoming king over all Israel remained incomplete. And in this chapter, the complexity of leadership becomes evident as David moves from being a fugitive to a king, yet not a king overall, navigating a reality where he must lead effectively within his current scope, while remaining aware of the broader picture. And this requires a balance of action and restraint, of building what is in front of him while not forcing what is yet to come. And through it all, the same pattern continues to emerge, that David's journey is not defined by sudden leaps but by steady progression, by moments that build upon one another, each contributing to the fulfillment of what has been promised. And as he sits in Hebron, no longer hiding in caves but not yet seated on the throne of a united kingdom, he stands at a midpoint in his story, a place where the past has shaped him and the future is beginning to take form. And though challenges remain and the path ahead is not without conflict, there is a sense that the foundation has been laid, that the years of preparation have not been in vain, and that the story is moving forward in a way that reflects both divine purpose and human response, setting the stage for what will come next as the divisions of the kingdom move toward resolution and the full scope of David's calling continues to unfold. The slow and often fragile balance between the house of Saul and the growing strength of David had stretched across years, shaped by shifting loyalties, personal ambitions, and the quiet but persistent movement of events that neither side could fully control. And though David had been established as king over Judah in Hebron, the rest of Israel remained under the leadership of Ishbosheth, sustained largely by the influence and command of Abner, whose authority held the fragile structure together. Yet even within that structure, cracks had begun to form, because leadership built on position without unity often struggles to maintain stability. And it was in this context that tension arose between Ishbosheth and Abner, a conflict that revealed the underlying weakness of Saul's remaining house, as accusations and mistrust disrupted what little cohesion remained. And Abner, recognizing both the instability of his current position and the inevitability of change, made a decisive turn, choosing to shift his allegiance toward David, initiating a process that would alter the direction of the entire nation. And when he approached David with the intention of bringing the rest of Israel under his rule, it was not merely a political move, but a recognition of where authority was ultimately heading. And David, though aware of the significance of this offer, did not accept it without condition, asking that Michal, Saul's daughter and his former wife, be returned to him, a request that carried both personal and symbolic meaning, reconnecting him to Saul's line in a way that reinforced his legitimacy. And as Abner moved to fulfill this condition, and to gather support among the tribes, speaking to the elders of Israel and reminding them that they had long desired David as their king, the momentum toward unity began to build, creating a sense that the long period of division was nearing its end. Yet even as this transition unfolded, it was not without complication, because the history of conflict and personal grievance could not be erased simply by agreement, and this became evident when Joab, David's commander, learned of Abner's actions, and driven by both suspicion and a desire for vengeance over the death of his brother Asahel, he acted independently, confronting Abner and killing him, an act that threatened to destabilize the fragile progress that had been made. And when David learned of what had happened, his response was immediate and clear, distancing himself from the act, declaring his innocence, and publicly mourning Abner's death, recognizing that the loss of a figure who had been instrumental in the unification process could have far-reaching consequences. And through his actions, David demonstrated a commitment to justice and integrity, refusing to allow personal loyalty to override what was right, even when it involved those within his own ranks. And this response helped preserve the trust that was forming among the tribes, allowing the process of unification to continue despite the setback. And as the house of Saul weakened further, culminating in the assassination of Ishbosheth by two of his own men, the final obstacle to David's reign over all Israel was removed, though not in a way that David approved of, as he responded to the news by executing those responsible, making it clear that he would not accept the throne through acts of betrayal or violence against the rightful lineage, reinforcing once again that his leadership would be grounded in principles rather than opportunism. And with the path now open, the elders of Israel came to Hebron, acknowledging what had become evident over time, that David was the one who had led them in the past, who had demonstrated both capability and character, and who had been chosen to shepherd the nation. And in a moment that brought resolution to years of division, they anointed him as king over all Israel, marking the fulfillment of what had been set in motion long ago in a quiet house in Bethlehem. Yet even in this moment of completion, David's approach remained consistent, as he did not seize power with force but received it through recognition and agreement, establishing a foundation for his reign that was built on unity rather than domination. And one of his first major actions as king over all Israel reflected both strategic insight and symbolic significance, as he set his sights on Jerusalem, a city that had remained outside of Israelite control, held by the Jebusites and considered difficult to capture. Yet David recognized its potential as a central location that could unify the tribes, not tied to any single group, but positioned in a way that could serve as a shared capital. And through a combination of determination and tactical execution, he and his men succeeded in taking the city, establishing it as the City of David, a place that would become the political and spiritual center of the nation. And as he settled there, his influence continued to grow, not only within Israel but among surrounding nations, as alliances formed and recognition of his leadership extended beyond his own people. And yet, even as his position strengthened, the challenges did not disappear, because the Philistines, aware of his rise, moved to confront him, testing whether this new king would stand as firmly as he had in the past. And in response, David sought direction before engaging, demonstrating that his approach to leadership remained rooted in dependence on God rather than assumption. And with each victory that followed, his reputation solidified, reinforcing the sense that his reign was marked by both strength and guidance. And as this chapter unfolds, the transition from division to unity becomes clear, not as a sudden shift, but as the result of a series of decisions, actions, and responses that collectively brought the nation to this point. And David, now king over all Israel, stands in a position that reflects both the fulfillment of promise and the beginning of a new phase, one that will require him to lead not from the margins but from the center, carrying the weight of an entire nation. And though the path that brought him here was marked by hardship, by seasons of waiting, and by moments of testing, it has prepared him for what lies ahead, shaping a leader who understands both the responsibility of his role and the importance of remaining grounded in the principles that have guided him thus far. As the story moves forward into a period where the focus shifts from becoming king to being king, from establishing authority to sustaining it, and from navigating personal survival to guiding a people towards stability and purpose, with Jerusalem now standing as the heart of that vision, and David positioned at the center of a kingdom that is finally fully his to lead. With the kingdom finally unified under David and Jerusalem established as its center, the nature of his leadership began to shift from securing power to shaping purpose, as the years of conflict, pursuit, and division gave way to a season where the focus turned inward toward the spiritual identity of the nation and the role David would play, not just as a king, but as a man seeking to align his rule with the presence and will of God. And though his authority had been firmly established through victories and recognition, David understood that true strength did not rest solely in military success or political unity, but in the relationship between the people and the God who had guided them. And it was this understanding that stirred within him a desire that went beyond governance, leading him to consider the place of the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred symbol of God's presence that had long remained outside the central life of the nation. And as David reflected on the contrast between his own residence in a palace of cedar and the ark residing in a tent, something within him was unsettled, because the disparity seemed to highlight a misalignment in priorities, prompting him to take action to bring the ark into Jerusalem, not as a display of power, but as an expression of devotion, a way of centering the nation's life around the presence of God. And so preparations were made, and the ark was brought out with celebration, with music, with joy that reflected the significance of the moment, as the people gathered and David himself participated fully, not as a distant ruler but as one engaged in the act, dancing before the Lord with a freedom that revealed the depth of his worship. And yet even within this moment of celebration, there came a sudden and sobering interruption as Uzzah, one of the men guiding the ark, reached out to steady it when the oxen stumbled, and in doing so touched what was considered holy, resulting in his immediate death, an event that halted the procession and introduced a sense of fear and confusion, because what had begun as an act of devotion now carried the weight of misunderstanding and consequence. And David, confronted with the reality that good intentions did not override the need for reverence and obedience, paused, choosing not to bring the ark into Jerusalem immediately but to leave it in the house of Obed-Edom, where it remained for a time, during which it became evident that the presence of the ark brought blessing, prompting David to reconsider and approach the situation with greater care, ensuring that the proper methods were followed. And when the ark was finally brought into Jerusalem, it was done with both joy and reverence, marking a moment where celebration and understanding came together. And as the procession moved forward, David's expression of worship once again stood out, unrestrained and wholehearted, though not without criticism, as Michal, Saul's daughter, observed his actions and responded with disdain, viewing his behavior as undignified, a reaction that revealed a difference in perspective between outward appearance and inward devotion. And David's response to her criticism reflected his priorities clearly, emphasizing that his actions were not for the approval of others but for God, demonstrating a willingness to be misunderstood in the pursuit of genuine worship. And as the ark was placed within the tent prepared for it, David offered sacrifices and blessings, establishing a pattern of worship that would shape the spiritual life of the nation, appointing individuals to minister before the ark, to give thanks, to praise, and to remember the acts of God, creating a structure that integrated worship into the daily rhythm of Israel's life. And it was within this context that another desire began to form within David's heart as he considered building a permanent house for the ark, a temple that would replace the temporary tent and reflect the importance of God's presence in a tangible way. And when he shared this intention with the prophet Nathan, it initially seemed appropriate, even commendable, yet the response that came from God through Nathan redirected David's plans in a way that shifted the focus from what he would build to what would be built through him, as God made it clear that David would not be the one to construct the temple, but that his son would carry out that task. And instead, God established a covenant with David, promising that his house and his kingdom would endure, that his lineage would continue, and that from his line would come a king whose reign would be everlasting, a promise that extended beyond David's immediate understanding, pointing toward a future that would unfold over generations. And in receiving this message, David's response was not one of disappointment but of humility, as he sat before the Lord and reflected on what had been spoken, acknowledging his own position, his past, and the magnitude of what had been promised, recognizing that what had been given to him was not earned but granted, and expressing gratitude that encompassed both his personal journey and the future of his descendants. And this moment captures the essence of what it means to have a heart for God, not defined by perfection or absence of failure, but by a posture of humility, a willingness to listen, to adjust, and to respond with gratitude, even when plans change or expectations are redirected. And as David continued to lead, this orientation toward God remained central, influencing decisions, shaping the culture of the nation, and reinforcing the understanding that leadership was not merely about authority but about alignment, about ensuring that the direction of the kingdom reflected something greater than the will of the one who sat on the throne. And in this chapter, the focus shifts from external conflict to internal devotion, from establishing rule to cultivating relationship, as David's actions reveal a desire to center everything around the presence of God. And though challenges would continue to arise, as they do in any life, the foundation being laid here would serve as a reference point, a reminder that at the core of David's leadership was not just the role he held, but the heart he carried, one that sought after God, that recognized dependence, and that remained open to guidance even when it led in unexpected directions. And as the kingdom settled into this new phase, with Jerusalem as its center and the ark as its focal point, the story moves forward with a sense of established purpose, setting the stage for what will come next, as the complexities of leadership, personal choices, and their consequences continue to unfold in ways that will test and reveal the depth of that heart in the chapters ahead. The aftermath of David's failure did not unfold in a single moment or resolve quickly, but instead moved through his life like a slow and unrelenting tide, touching every part of his household, his leadership, and his inner life, revealing that the consequences of even a forgiven sin can extend far beyond the moment of repentance, shaping the path forward in ways that demand endurance, humility, and a renewed dependence on God. And for David, this new season was not defined by the external enemies he had once faced with confidence, but by internal fractures that began to surface within his own family, fractures that reflected both the complexity of human relationships and the ripple effects of decisions made at the highest level, as tension, betrayal, and pain emerged in ways that could not be controlled through strength or strategy alone. And one of the most significant of these challenges came through his son Absalom, whose presence in David's life would become both a source of deep sorrow and a test of his ability to lead not just a nation, but his own household, because Absalom's story unfolded with a mixture of charisma, ambition, and unresolved grievance, beginning with events that exposed the breakdown of justice within the family, where wrongdoing went unaddressed and resentment was allowed to grow, creating an environment where Absalom took matters into his own hands, carrying out an act of vengeance that led to his exile. And though time passed and reconciliation was eventually allowed in a limited sense, the restoration was incomplete, leaving space for bitterness to remain. And it was within that space that Absalom began to position himself, gradually winning the favor of the people through calculated interactions, presenting himself as approachable, understanding and attentive in ways that contrasted with the perceived distance of the king. And over time this approach gained traction, as the hearts of the people began to shift, not through force but through influence, and what had once been a unified kingdom under David's leadership now faced the threat of division from within, as Absalom declared himself king and initiated a rebellion that forced David into a position he had not faced since his years in the wilderness. Not as a fugitive pursued by an external king, but as a father and leader forced to flee from his own son, leaving Jerusalem once again, this time not to escape Saul, but to preserve the possibility of resolution without immediate destruction. And as he departed, the weight of the moment was evident, not only in the physical act of leaving the city he had established, but in the emotional reality of what it represented. As loyalty was tested, alliances were revealed, and the fragility of human trust became clear. Yet even in this, David's response carried a familiar pattern, choosing not to grasp for control through immediate retaliation, but allowing events to unfold with a measure of restraint, instructing those who remained loyal to him to act with wisdom, even placing individuals within Absalom's circle to provide insight, demonstrating that while he would not abandon his responsibility, he would also not abandon his principles. And as the conflict moved toward confrontation, the inevitability of battle could not be avoided, despite David's desire to handle the situation with care, particularly concerning Absalom, whom he instructed his commanders to deal with gently for his sake. a request that revealed the tension between his role as king and his role as father, a tension that would not be easily resolved, because when the battle took place, though David's forces prevailed, the outcome brought not relief but grief, as Absalom was killed, contrary to David's instructions, and when the news reached him, his response was not one of victory, but of deep lament, crying out for his son, expressing a sorrow that overshadowed the military success, highlighting the reality that not all victories bring satisfaction, especially when they come at the cost of personal loss. And in the days that followed, David was called to return to Jerusalem to resume his place as king, yet even that return required careful navigation, as the divisions within the kingdom had not disappeared, and the process of restoring unity involved addressing the concerns and loyalties of the tribes, reaffirming his leadership while also acknowledging the complexities that had arisen. And throughout this period, David's actions continued to reflect a man shaped by both experience and reflection, someone who understood that leadership was not about maintaining an image of perfection, but about responding to imperfection with humility and a commitment to what was right. And as time moved forward, the focus began to shift toward the future, toward what would come after David, as the question of succession emerged, not as a distant concern, but as an immediate necessity. And in this context, the role of Solomon became central, as David, guided by both divine direction and practical consideration, prepared the way for his son to take the throne, ensuring that the transition would be established with clarity and providing instructions not only for governance but for the building of the temple, the very project he had once desired to undertake himself, gathering materials, organizing resources, and setting the stage for Solomon to carry forward what he had been told he would not complete. And in these final acts, David's legacy began to take form in a way that extended beyond his own lifetime, not defined solely by his achievements or his failures, but by the totality of his journey, a life that encompassed both faithfulness and faltering, both triumph and trial, yet remained anchored in a relationship with God that endured through each phase. And as he approached the end of his life, the reflection on that journey would have carried a depth shaped by everything he had experienced, from the quiet fields of Bethlehem to the throne of a united kingdom, from the solitude of the wilderness to the complexities of leadership, from moments of unwavering trust to moments of profound failure. And in all of it, the thread that remained consistent was not perfection but pursuit, a heart that despite its missteps continued to turn back toward God, to seek alignment, to respond to correction, and to move forward with a sense of purpose that was not diminished by the challenges faced. And so the story of David closes not as a simple narrative of success or failure, but as a layered account of a life lived in the tension between calling and humanity, a reminder that legacy is not built on isolated moments, but on the cumulative impact of choices, responses, and relationships, and that even in the presence of consequences, there remains space for redemption, for growth, and for the continuation of what has been set in motion as the kingdom passes into new hands, and the influence of David's life continues to echo, not only in the history of Israel, but in the enduring understanding of what it means to lead with a heart that seeks after God, even when the path is marked by both light and shadow. The life of David begins not with power, recognition, or influence, but with obscurity, and this is essential to understanding everything that follows, because David's story is not simply the rise of a king, but the formation of a heart, a gradual shaping that takes place long before any public moment ever reveals it. As he grows up in Bethlehem as the youngest son of Jesse, positioned naturally at the margins of his own household, overlooked in a way that is not necessarily malicious but deeply formative, because being unseen creates a different kind of awareness, one that is not driven by external validation but by internal development. And it is in this hidden environment that David learns responsibility through tending sheep, a task that appears simple, but in reality demands vigilance, courage, and consistency, as the shepherd must guide, protect, and provide without recognition, often alone, often in silence. And it is precisely in this silence that David's inner life begins to take shape, as he develops a relationship with God that is not mediated by structure or ceremony, but formed through direct experience, through observation of creation, through moments of danger and deliverance, and through the kind of reflection that only solitude allows. And this early formation is critical because it establishes a foundation that is not dependent on position, meaning that when David eventually steps into visibility, he does so with an identity already rooted in something deeper than circumstance. And this becomes evident when Samuel arrives to anoint a new king, passing over the obvious choices, David's older, stronger brothers, in favor of the one who had not even been considered worth calling in from the fields. And this moment introduces one of the central tensions of David's life, the distinction between how he is seen by others and how he is seen by God. Because while human perception prioritizes outward appearance, God's selection is based on the condition of the heart, and this distinction does not immediately change David's circumstances as he returns to the same fields after being anointed, yet internally everything has shifted, because he now carries an awareness of calling that exists independently of external confirmation, and this creates a prolonged period of tension where identity is established before opportunity, where promise precedes fulfillment, and where the discipline required is not in achieving something, but in waiting without losing alignment. And this tension continues as David enters the service of Saul, not as a warrior or leader, but as a musician, using his skill with the harp to bring relief to a king whose internal instability reflects a loss of connection with God. And here again the contrast is striking, because David's strength is not initially expressed through force, but through presence, through the ability to bring peace into an environment marked by unrest. And this reveals an important aspect of leadership that will define his later reign. That influence is not always exercised through authority, but often through the capacity to stabilize what is unsettled. Yet even as David moves within the palace, his defining public moment comes not in that controlled environment, but on the battlefield, where his encounter with Goliath serves as both a literal and symbolic turning point, because the giant represents not only an external threat, but a collective fear that has immobilized an entire army, and David's response is shaped by his prior formation, as he does not interpret the situation through the lens of limitation, but through the lens of trust, drawing on his experiences in the fields where he had already faced danger without the presence of an audience. And this is significant because it demonstrates that public courage is often the result of private faithfulness, that the ability to confront what others fear is developed in moments when no one is watching, and the victory over Goliath propels David into visibility, altering his trajectory in a way that brings both opportunity and complication, as success introduces him into a new relational dynamic, particularly with Jonathan, whose immediate and profound connection with David represents one of the most significant friendships in the biblical narrative, a relationship marked by mutual recognition, loyalty, and a willingness to prioritize purpose over personal advancement, as Jonathan, though positioned as the natural heir to the throne, acknowledges David's calling and aligns himself with it. And this stands in stark contrast to Saul's response, as the king's perception of David shifts from appreciation to suspicion, and eventually to hostility, revealing another central tension in David's life, the intersection of favor and opposition, because the same qualities that draw admiration from some provoke insecurity in others, and Saul's growing jealousy transforms the environment from one of opportunity to one of danger, forcing David into a prolonged season of displacement, where he becomes a fugitive within the very nation he is destined to lead. And this period in the wilderness is not merely a delay but a continuation of his formation, as it tests his ability to navigate leadership without position, to build loyalty among those who are themselves marginalized, and to make decisions under pressure that reflect his values rather than his circumstances. And it is within this context that one of the most revealing aspects of David's character emerges, his restraint, particularly in moments where he has the opportunity to eliminate Saul and secure his own future, yet chooses instead to refrain, recognizing that taking control through force would compromise the integrity of the calling he has received. And this decision underscores a critical principle in his life, that the method of attaining power is as important as the possession of it, and that trust in God's timing requires the willingness to forego immediate solutions in favor of long-term alignment. Yet even within this disciplined approach, David is not portrayed as flawless, as his interactions with figures like Nabal reveal moments where his response is driven by emotion rather than principle, requiring external intervention to redirect him. And this highlights another dimension of his development, that growth is not linear, and that even those who demonstrate remarkable faith can still encounter moments of misjudgment. And it is in these moments that the presence of wise counsel becomes essential, reinforcing the idea that leadership is not sustained in isolation, but through the interplay of personal conviction and external guidance. And as this first part of David's life unfolds, what becomes increasingly clear is that his journey is defined not by a single defining moment, but by a series of tensions that shape his identity over time. Obscurity and recognition, calling and waiting, favor and opposition, opportunity and restraint, strength and vulnerability, and it is within these tensions that David is formed into the kind of leader he will become, not through the absence of challenge, but through his response to it, setting the stage for the next phase of his life, where the question will no longer be how he becomes king, but how he carries the weight of that role once it is fully realized. As the story of David moves from formation into fulfillment, the central tension shifts from becoming to being, from the question of whether he will rise to power to the far more complex question of what he will do with it once it is fully his. And this transition is not marked by a sudden clarity or ease, but by a gradual unfolding in which the weight of leadership introduces new challenges that cannot be solved with the same instincts that carried him through the wilderness. Because ruling requires not only courage and faith, but sustained wisdom, restraint, and the ability to navigate systems, relationships, and responsibilities that extend far beyond personal survival. And when David is finally established as king over all Israel, following the decline of Saul and the unification of the tribes, his early actions reveal a leader who understands both the symbolic and strategic dimensions of his role. As he captures Jerusalem and establishes it as the capital, creating a political and cultural center that is not tied to any single tribe, thereby reinforcing unity, and then brings the Ark of the Covenant into the city, signaling that the spiritual identity of the nation is to remain central to its political life. And these decisions demonstrate a continuity with the heart that was formed in obscurity, a desire to align leadership with devotion, to ensure that power does not drift away from its source. Yet it is precisely in this period of stability and success that a different kind of vulnerability emerges, because the absence of external pressure can often expose internal weaknesses, and this becomes evident in David's moral failure involving Bathsheba, an event that represents a significant departure from the patterns of restraint that had previously defined him, as he moves from observation to action in a way that disregards both relational boundaries and ethical responsibility. And when the consequences of that decision begin to surface, his response shifts into concealment, revealing how quickly the misuse of power can compound itself, moving from desire to deception to orchestrated harm, culminating in the death of Uriah. And this moment is critical not only because of the act itself, but because it exposes the reality that past faithfulness does not guarantee future integrity, that the same person capable of remarkable trust can also make deeply damaging choices when vigilance is lost. And yet what follows is equally important, as the confrontation by Nathan brings David face to face with the truth of his actions, and his response, acknowledgement without deflection, reveals that the core of his identity, though compromised, is not erased, as he chooses repentance over denial, a decision that reorients him even as it does not remove the consequences, and those consequences unfold not as isolated incidents, but as a sustained period of relational fracture within his household, particularly through the rebellion of his son Absalom, whose actions reflect both personal grievance and political ambition. And this internal conflict forces David into a position that mirrors his earlier life in form but not in meaning, as he once again flees Jerusalem, yet this time not as a rising figure being pursued unjustly, but as a king confronting the repercussions of his own leadership failures. And the emotional weight of this moment is intensified by the fact that the opposition comes from within his own family, creating a tension that cannot be resolved through simple victory, because even when his forces prevail, the outcome is marked by grief rather than triumph, as Absalom's death becomes a moment of profound sorrow, illustrating that success in conflict does not equate to restoration in relationship. And this period of David's life highlights the complexity of leadership at its highest level, where decisions are rarely clean, where personal and public responsibilities intersect in ways that create unavoidable tension, and where the ability to lead requires not only strength but the capacity to endure loss without losing direction. And as David continues to rule in the aftermath of these events, there is a noticeable shift in tone, a movement toward reflection and preparation, as he begins to focus more intentionally on what will follow his reign, recognizing that legacy is not defined solely by what one accomplishes, but by what one leaves behind. And in this context, his preparation for Solomon becomes central, as he gathers resources for the temple, provides instruction, and seeks to ensure that the next generation is positioned to continue what he has begun. And this act of preparation reveals a level of humility and perspective that acknowledges both his role and his limitations, understanding that he will not complete everything himself, and that part of faithful leadership is enabling others to carry the vision forward. And when viewed as a whole, David's life resists simplistic categorization, because it encompasses both extraordinary faith and significant failure, both decisive leadership and moments of misjudgment, both deep devotion and human weakness. And it is precisely this complexity that makes his story enduring, not as an example of perfection, but as a study in what it means to pursue alignment with God across a lifetime, to respond to both success and failure in ways that reflect an ongoing relationship rather than a fixed state. And in the end, David's legacy is not defined by any single chapter, but by the trajectory of his life, a trajectory that consistently returns to God even after deviation, that seeks restoration after failure, and that demonstrates that the measure of a life is not found in the absence of error, but in the direction one moves after it, leaving behind a model of leadership that is both aspirational and accessible, grounded not in flawlessness, but in a persistent pursuit of what is right, even when the path is marked by both light and shadow.